So now I'd like to introduce our leader and speaker, Al Stawsky. Al has been a member of this congregation for over 25 years. He has been involved in racial and social justice work for most of his life. If I list all of his accomplishments and leadership roles, I would have to add another hour to our service. I do want to mention that Al received a Lifetime Achievement Award from UU Faith Action of New Jersey, as well as an award for racial and social justice work from the YWCA of Bergen County. He was the chair of our racial and social justice team for many years, many of those years with his wife, May. And he continues to be an active member of the MLK Birthday Celebration Committee and the Juneteenth Committee. We are honored to have him with us today. Let's give him a warm UU hello. Al, I hope you were able to see that. We gave you a big welcome. And now Al Stawsky on the origin of U.S. racism.
Thank you, Debbie, for that very nice introduction. How many people here watched some of the news from the Washington Monument on the 60th anniversary of the March on Washington? I did, and remembered that time very fondly, and was very aware of the fact that things are still in the middle of the fight. It's not over. It's still in the stages of being determined. And then, of course, having your heart broken and hearing about the events in Jacksonville, where 3 of our brothers and sisters were murdered by a white youth whose mind was poisoned by racism and became a suicide terrorist. I can't tell you how angry and furious and saddened that made me, and I think you as well. Before I start the talk, I want to thank Debbie and Karen, our UU president and one of our leading members, for helping me prepare this talk. I want to make clear that if I stumble or get confused, which is possible nowadays, it's my fault and certainly not theirs. There's a straight line in history from the events of many, many years ago, before our country was even formed, and the events of yesterday. And our understanding of history allows us to understand what's happening today, and also to try to find ways of making it come out better. As the saying goes, the past is not dead. It's not even past. It's still happening now. Yesterday is a vibrant example of that. My talk today is about racism and the slavery that spawned it. People ask, was slavery a result of racism, or was racism a result of slavery? Slavery and racism are not the same thing. You can be a slave without racism, such as happened in our history, and you can have racism without slavery, as we have today in our society. Slavery without racism is an example that relates to the English colony in the Chesapeake Bay called Virginia hundreds of years ago. It was said in the book that was written about that period, as well as surrounding periods, that if you went to Virginia in the 1600s, after the colony is formed, there were no white people there. That's strange. There were only English and some Africans and perhaps some Irish, but there were no white people at that time. Theodore Allen, who wrote the monumental study, The Invention of the White Race, in 2 volumes, says, in 20 years of research and looking at source material in Virginia in the 1600s, there is no mention of white as being a synonym for European, nor was there any mention of black as being a synonym for Africans or Negroes. What was talked about was English. You were English, or you were Irish, or you were African or Negro, but there was no white. That didn't come till later, and for a very deliberate reason. In fact, in the period of the early 1600s until about 1670, there is no evidence that there was any law that particularly singled out people of color, Africans, for any reason whatsoever. Certainly they came as slaves, even though many of them were able to rise above that, because during that period things were somewhat flexible and the lines of slavery versus non-slavery were vague and changing. Most of the bonded laborers there were white English, mostly youth, who were there as indentured servants, serving under a bond for 7 years, and then promised 50 acres of land, which somehow didn't come about very easily. There were also laborers with small plots of land who were bonded to a landowner, such as today we have or had which is today we had
Al, would you like me to read the quote now?
no, not
Okay, you'll let me know when, right?
yes.
Okay.
Um, I asked Debbie to be kind enough to read the quote from Professor Richard Bell from the University of Maryland, who describes this period that I introduced. Debbie?
It wasn't until the 1670s that race slavery would come to dominate the Chesapeake tobacco economy. Before the 1670s, planter preference was for white indentured servants, typically young male workers from England who agreed to work on a Virginia plantation for 3 to 7 years and then would be freed. During this period, race was only one marker of unfreedom among many in the social order, and was as much the condition of English men and women as for many new Africans. However, it was a period of fluidity and opportunity for many Africans. For example, they were allowed to own land. They could buy their freedom, and they could defend themselves in court. But society was changing in the late 1600s. After about 1650, it became more difficult to acquire white indentured servants from England. Equally troubling for the planter elites, the white servants already in Virginia were becoming restless and rebellious. In 1676, matters came to a head.
After that period, and after a period when there were much resistance to the slave and bonded labor conditions in the Virginia colony, a landowner and slave owner named Nathaniel Bacon was struggling to get his share of the large and fertile land around the Chesapeake, which already had been taken by the older landowners who had come earlier. He decided to fight to get his share of the land and to make war on the colonial administration and the royal governor. In order to do this fight, he promised these bonded servants and enslaved laborers that he would give them land and free them if they joined him and supported him in his struggle for his share of the land. This was Bacon's rebellion. And thousands of black and white laborers joined him and marched with him to Jamestown. They were successful in ousting the governor and driving him out of the colony. They took over Jamestown and in the fighting burned it to the ground. They took over and became the Assembly of Virginia. This was a short-lived victory because Nathaniel Bacon died suddenly of typhus and things became in disarray. But thousands of the bonded servants and slaves decided to continue their fight, and this time not for land for Bacon, but for land for themselves. This rebellion was put down by the British Army that finally came to Britain, and many of the rebellious laborers were hanged. This was a period when black and white laborers worked together, fighting for freedom, and reflected the period before then when black and white bonded laborers and slaves worked in the same fields under the same conditions where there was yet no racism. How did the landowners react and the slave owners react? after putting down of Bacon's rebellion and rebellious slave and bonded laborers. Debbie will read a quote from Professor Bell describing what happened after Bacon's rebellion was put down. Debbie.
After Bacon's rebellion, the planter class endeavored to solve their labor crisis by reducing their dependence on white indentured servants and instead embracing race slavery. It became more important for the white landowners to formalize in the law what it meant to be a slave and what it meant to be free. They did so in a series of slave codes, which, among other things, restricted movement to the boundaries of the slave's own plantation and required them to get a pass from their master if they needed to go further. Limited slaves' ability to trade with one another. Prohibited more than 4 slaves from meeting together. Allowed for the creation of slave patrols, which could catch any slaves out without a pass. The cumulative effect of this flurry of new laws was to enshrine race slavery as a distinct and peculiar category in American law. The landowners offered all kinds of incentives for farmers and white ex-servants to sign up to be militiamen and passed a series of laws designed to make poor whites and enslaved poor blacks detest each other. Subsequent laws drew a wedge between whites and blacks ever deeper.
And so the laws continued to be refined and dug deeper into the developing society and continued through the American Revolution and helped define the new nation that was born in the American Revolution and the Constitution. This was the beginning of racism. This was a deliberate formation of a racist law in society that kept developing and being refined and dug its tentacles into all the developing institutions of society. Who was it that did this? It was the landowners and slave owners. But not only was it the slaves at the time that was subject to these restrictions, they also extended it to free African Americans. In the early 1700s, before the United States was formed, the British Assembly passed a law denying free African Americans in the British colony the right to vote, which they had had until that time. This was a law that was English law that affected landowners and that extended to the landowners in the English colony. That law was something completely new in British law, that some people could be singled out to not to vote, even though they had qualified in other respects. The Attorney General of the Colonial Assembly of Parliament in London sent a message to Virginia saying, I cannot see how why one free man should be used worse than any other merely upon account of his complexion to vote at elections. To which the Virginia governor explained, we took the vote away from African Americans, although he didn't use that term, because we wanted to mark Black people and Africans for all time. That was to make a racist group out of them, subject to racism. And this is the beginning of racism. Who were the people who did this? They were the landowners and slave owners in the Virginia colony. We know some of them from the American Revolution. They were the ancestors and descendants of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and the other founding fathers. That's shocking. They were the ones who invented racism. They were the ones who started racism. History teaches that unmistakably. And we've been brainwashed into not understanding that and not knowing that. How is it possible? How is it possible that someone like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who were the champions of liberal democracy and were the leaders of the formation of the United States, which historically was a historical breakthrough in the formation for the first time in history of a liberal democracy republic, a liberal democratic republic, and was change that was echoed and had effects, aggressive effects throughout the world. This is a contradiction. Well, remember the previous reading I gave on Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Things sometimes involve being opposites that are all rolled together in one person. And this was the case here, and it's something that it would be interesting to examine, and maybe we should get it later. There's a straight line from that law denying the vote to free Black men in early 1700. There's a straight line from that event all the way through the American Revolution, where slavery in the United States to be formed was without a vote. The American Constitution had a 3/5 clause that gave slave owners all the votes of the non-voting slaves so they can dominate the new nation's government, all the way to the Ku Klux Klan denying the vote, free Africans free from slavery through 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 the lynchings and the segregation and the Jim Crow denial of Black people from voting. all the way to today. The suppression of the vote, legal and illegal, being pushed in many of the states. There's a straight line connecting those events, and knowledge of the past and how it was part of our history, and how before this happened, there was no racism. And now we can find a way to destroy racism and create a situation where there now is no racism again. And that is what we are fighting for. And that is what the March on Washington was all about. And that was what the shooting in Jacksonville was all about. It is not enough for white people to be sympathetic, to be neutral. It's not even enough to be an ally. To be an ally and have a sense of optional about it. It is necessary for white Main Street people, laboring people, and trade union people, and students, and professors, and taxi drivers to be partners in the fight against racism, because that's a fight that has to do with the goals and future and lives of everyone in our society. And we have to stand together with our brothers and sisters, whether they be black or white, because they're our people. And because that's the way we're going to defeat the poison of fascism and make a future for our country and a future for ourselves. Thank you very much.
If you like this video, please like us on YouTube, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and click on the bell to be notified whenever we post a new video. Thank you.